My name is Luisa Oliveira, and I'm the Senior Planner for Landscape Design. On behalf of Alderman McWaters and the Mayor, I'd like to welcome you to the second meeting that we're having on the Prospect Hill Park. We had a walkthrough in the summer, and this is the one where we're really starting to talk about the park, what changes are going to happen. I don't think that actually works. I think it just works for the camera. No, they're not. They're for... This is being filmed for cable and Somerville neighborhood news. So if for folks that weren't able to come, they can watch it here. Can you hear me? No. Oh, okay. Okay. I will speak louder, or maybe move forward if. Yeah. All the above. All the above. Okay. So. I want to introduce the folks that are here today. My boss, the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure, has joined us today. This is Brad Rawson. And we have also from the Planning Office, the Historic Planner and Zoning Planner, Sarah White. She has to leave shortly because she has another meeting to go to. And then we have the design team from Kyle Zick Landscape Architects, and that is Kyle Zick himself, and Danielle Desolates. So we have kind of a lot to do today. I would start with me advancing the slides, which I think, down here. Okay.
And Louisa, in the spirit of kind of a casual conversation that we have with a small group, while we're getting technology ready, let me again acknowledge Bob and all of his hard work to get this project, articulated, strategized, funded, planned. Thanks for all your service, Bob. I think folks sometimes at these moments of these crossroads in our community will sometimes say, does the city remain committed to this important project? And the answer is yes. Thank goodness everybody's been advocating for longer than the 10 years that I've been here to get this project kind of strategized and onto our project queue. So you can expect the same level of service, the same community process and progressive design work coming out of our staff and our hired consultants, even as we kind of enter this new era in 2018. So again, just really wanted to acknowledge the fact that Bob did help us push that. We look forward to working with Ben and all the members of the new board. Again, wherever your path took you yesterday at the ballot box, thanks for participating. Stick with us. We got a lot of important work to do.
Thank you, Brad. So the first thing, just a little bit of table setting. In terms of communicating about the project, I want to make sure that you know that we have a number of channels that we're putting the word out about this project. So there is a project page on the city's website. This is the URL. If you go into the new website and just type Prospect Hill, it'll bring you to that project page. On there, right now is the recap from the first walkthrough. The taping of this meeting will be there as well, so if there are neighbors that couldn't come, they can see the content as well as the slideshow. So all that information, I tried to keep that updated, is on the website. There's also an email list, and I have a sign-in sheet. If you don't have email and you want to give your phone number or your address, I will give you a call or send you a flyer for the next meeting. But if you are not on the email list, please make sure that you sign in on this list and that you print in your best penmanship, because that is the most difficult thing, is when I can't read your email and then people say, I never got a flyer, and I remember that I couldn't read your email. So the information, when we have set up a meeting, it goes to our communications department, and that gets sent out to the newspapers, gets put on the city website, it goes on the cable reel, it also goes to the language liaison, so we put flyers on in the different social media in Portuguese, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. And I also spent a couple of mornings flyering. I do want to point out that for some strange reason, people kept ripping the signs down. So unfortunately, we sometimes have to tend with that vandalism, and when people say, oh, it was not flyered, it was flyered. I can't control what happens after my tape goes up. And then the other thing I want to point out is that I do flyer on the doorknobs, but we are not legally able to put things in the mailboxes because that's tampering with mail. So sometimes, as you see in the second image, we have to kind of slide a flyer there, and another tenant could come home or roommate could come home. Those often get lost. So people sometimes will say to us, you did not flyer, and I'm telling you that I know that I did. So we did flyer for this, but if you are always welcome to either give us a call, you can call the main number and ask for my name directly, or an email. There's always ways to communicate with us. So it's a pretty open communication chain in that way. Did any of you guys get flyers? I know, I put them there, 175. If you don't believe me, you can check my Fitbit. Oh. It was a beautiful morning, so I got to have a really nice walk in the neighborhood. Okay, so quickly, the timeline. So it's November 2017 right now. Our big deadline, our big thing that we're working towards is we are waiting right now to hear from a state grant called a park grant, which I'm very optimistic that we're going to get. That funding will support this, plus a match from the Community Preservation Act that I will be applying for. So if we get that park grant, we have to start construction on June 1st of 2018. So that's really the goal that we're moving towards. So working backwards, yes?
So that's the beginning of the summer. Why did you choose June 1st?
So we don't choose June 1st. The state of Massachusetts does. That is the deadline on which you start. And then also, all of the construction will have to happen in the summer because we can't do landscape construction in the winter. So our construction period is really when the weather permits. So we could start earlier, but there's no way and if you let me explain the process. So we have these community meetings. We'll have other community meetings until we all come to consensus on what the design is. Part of that is also meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission. And then we have to, we need to get the time to do the construction documents, which is a good month's time. And then we need to put the project out to bid. And from putting something out to bid to signing a contract generally takes an average of about 13 weeks. So we wouldn't, even if we wanted to start earlier than June, it's unlikely. It just does take this much time to get things done. So what we're hoping to do is meet that park deadline. The grant is called PARC, P-A-R-C. So that's kind of what our timeline looks like. Okay. In terms of the team that we have on the project, again, I have introduced myself, but I'm Luisa Oliveira. I'm a landscape architect and a parks planner. There are two of us in City Hall, and I'm really excited to be working on this project because it's such a historically important project. And then we also are working with, in our office, Sarah White, who's the zoning and historic planner, and I'm going to let her speak a little bit about the role the Historic Preservation Commission has in this parks project, because that's not always the case. And then I'll introduce the design team and we can kind of go from there. So Sarah, if you want to just give a little overview of the Historic Preservation Commission.
Sure.
Commission.
Can you hear me if I talk like this? Okay, good. I'm going to use my teacher voice because I was one. So my name is Sarah White. I am a preservation planner. I'm a zoning planner with the city. I staff the Historic Preservation Commission. And in this case, the Historic Preservation Commission has essentially final say over what happens on this property. And that's because this property is a single property local historic district. And a local historic district is a process by which, or it follows a process by which specific properties are tagged for protection because of their historic importance to the community, to the state, to the nation, et cetera. You can have many structures within a historic district, or you can have a single structure within a historic district. In this case, this is a city property that is a single structure historic district. And so what that means is, as this process goes along, eventually the city is going to need to come in front of the Historic District Commission for their approval, first their input and their approval of the final plans for this property. The Historic Preservation Commission is an independent body. It's a city body, but like the Zoning Board or the Planning Board or the Conservation Commission, they are independent bodies that make their own decisions according to the law that they're given. So in this instance, as a prelude to some of the bigger work that has to go on for this property, I have asked and had asked Louisa and a couple of colleagues to come in front of the Historic Preservation Commission to give them an idea that this project is coming down the pike. So we went in for an advisory review in front of the Historic Preservation Commission to get their feedback as to what they thought of the initial plans going forward and their input as to what they'd like to see. And during that process, we also shared with them some of the input from the community meetings that you had. And there was a whole list of suggestions that came out of a site walk and I think another, just the site walk. And so that was shared with them as well. And some of the things that came out of that community site walk might be able to be included in the plan in what ultimately is done, and some of it won't be just because it doesn't conform to the standards that the Historic Preservation Commission has to follow. One of the big pieces of advice that came out of this initial meeting with the commission was that they wanted to see the city going back somewhat to the 1903 plan, which was the original plan for this parcel and how it was laid out. So I believe that what the commission then said to the landscaping planners was that use that as a base, the 1903 plan, and then move outward from there and have a discussion about some of the changes to that 1903 plan that might better suit the property today, but still protect the historicity of it. That site was chosen and built as it was for very particular reasons. One of them being a certain view corridor to Boston and the church involved in the Revolution. So a lot of those things have changed over the decades that this property has been active and has changed. So there are some questions I think that the commission might want to see answered, such as how can we open that view corridor back into Boston, if at all that's possible. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion between the community, the Historic Preservation Commission, and the planning staff, both from a landscape perspective and from a historic preservation perspective. And I would encourage you all to come to the Historic Preservation Commission meetings. They meet once a month, and I think probably in the next month or two, we'll see the group from the planning office come back for another advisory review from the commission. What is key and what is important is that we meet with them on an advisory basis as often as we can to get their input so that when we do have to go in front of them for their final permissions, they feel that the majority of their questions have been answered. And that makes the whole process go smoother for everybody. So we're trying to pave that way now. Anybody has any questions about the Historic Preservation Commission, historic districts, how they operate, how we interact with them, Louisa will have contact information, and I'm more than happy to talk to any of you at any time. Any quick questions?
Is the 1903 plan accessible digitally for us to see what that looks like?
Yes, and we're going to be talking about that tonight.
Okay. All right, feel free to contact me anytime. Yep.
So the 1903 plan, actually, it's easy to visualize because it's exactly what's there right now. The park has essentially not been changed in 100 plus years. So, and we will be talking about that. I want to now dive into the design team. As you know, we issued an RFP sometime in March. And again, this is just an example of how long these things take. We had about 9 firms that applied to design this park. We interviewed 3 of them. And Kyle Zick, Landscape Architects, was chosen. They meet all of the insurance requirements and the requirements of the contract. And so I want to introduce them. And they're going to go over some of the history of the park and why they see it as important as us, but also give an introduction to the type of work that they see, that they have done, and the projects that they've been working on, so you can see why we felt they were a perfect match for this project in particular. So with that, I want to also mention that it's not just the landscape architects, but we also have some other consultants on the team, including a structural engineer, a civil engineer, an irrigation consultant, and I don't know what kind of engineer are they? A lot of engineers. So it is an inclusive team that aims to really get at all aspects of the park. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, and he's going to tell us about him.
Thank you, Louisa. All right. So it's only polite that I tell you more about who I am briefly and the work we do, because you don't have any sense of who we are. So Kyle Zick Landscape Architecture. I'm Kyle Zick. It's a 7-person firm based in Boston. The work we specialize in is historic preservation and passive parks. So I think Prospect Hill is both of those things. But we do other things. You know, these are just a few snapshots of the kind of things we do, ranging from more temporary things like tactical urbanism to coastal restoration or even urban forest management.
Can everyone hear Kyle?
I'll speak up too. So I wanted to show you a few example projects to give you a sense of our skill set, but also the range of projects. This one is at Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island. We were part of a master plan team and then one phase of implementation that restored the fort, made it handicap accessible from a self-guided tour perspective, which hadn't been done before, and also managed vegetation, which had kind of been overrun throughout the fort. And then in terms of interpretation, we created the scale model outside of the fort, so when the fort was closed, people could still understand what they were looking at. An urban square that we worked on in Charlestown called Winthrop Square, or also the training field, was an important part of the Revolutionary War. It was called the training field, where troops would muster and train to be able to, perform against the British. Now, this is very similar to your site in that that upper left image is what it looked like when we started. So it was bare earth, very little lawn, well used by dogs, people. There was a lot of competition with Norway maple trees, providing a lot of shade and root competition. But we wanted to reinvigorate that turf and make this a really viable park. And to do that, we wanted to do it in an organic way. So what we did is break up the compaction of the soil using compressed air, using what we call an air spade. So the lower right image is basically a pipe with holes in it attached to an air compressor, and they push it into the soil. It loosens everything up to about 18 inches. And then we incorporated leaf mulch compost, fish emulsion, and biochar, and then an irrigation system. So then the lower left image is the lawn in the same area, and that's 1 year after the project was done. And we did a whole soil health evaluation using a program that Cornell has to make sure we could do this in a way that restored it in a ecological way. And then we've done a number of projects called urban wilds in the city of Boston. So these are, as the name implies, not manicured parks. They're definitely passive. Usually they're land that was gifted to the city. This one falls in that category. There used to be a large manor house on this property that was destroyed and removed. But then, you have this site in Roxbury that is overgrown because no one's really kind of looking after it. And some activities are happening there that aren't really all that desirable. So we're called in to say, how do we manage the vegetation, improve view sheds, and make this a place that is identifiable as a park and that's cared for, and promote activities that really would be appropriate in the community. So we looked at signage, improving access, clearing of invasive vegetation, but also interpretation in a lot of different forms. And not just about the manor house or the person who was in the manor house, although that was a major part of the story. We also talked about, prior to that, early colonial settlement, but also Native American use. And then kind of a larger scale project that Danielle and I worked on just about a year ago was a trails master plan for Gettysburg National Military Park. So, completely different scale, but that's where we're applying outdoor handicap access, resource protection, archaeological protection, and vegetation management. So what I want to convey is that we know historic sites, we're comfortable in these places. And to take it one step further, we have kind of a niche in the Revolutionary War sites. And there's not many people who can say that. But so think of Prospect Hill as an important defensive position in many defensive positions in protecting Boston. We've also worked at Bunker Hill and Dorchester Heights, similar kind of like sister sites, but then also where the revolution started. I was at the Old North Bridge today, we're still consulting there. And then Battle Road Trail, a 5-mile trail that follows the retreat of the British back to Boston on April 19th, 1775. And then if you want to weave George Washington into it, his winter encampment at Valley Forge, but then 4 of his headquarter sites in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. So I'm going to stop bragging. Let's talk about your site. So what was great is that a really strong foundation has been laid for this project before we were even selected. So the community meeting that Louisa mentioned this summer, I think got a lot of great feedback. And we did this word map where the words that showed up more in the meeting notes are larger. So lighting was a key thought, or trees, or signage, and plants. And just because words are small doesn't mean they're not important either. So stormwater, or canopy, or connections, crosswalks. So this is really valuable for us to have that many people who were involved then, a snapshot in time of comments, and then we'll build on that with what you tell us tonight. And it's important to just also give you a sense of where we are in the process. We were selected and started a few weeks ago, and we're just getting up to speed in terms of the history, existing conditions, that kind of thing. We have not designed anything, and that's very purposeful. We wanted to understand what happened this summer, hear from you tonight, share some of our observations about the history and existing conditions, but then based on the previous meeting and then tonight, then we'll develop designs. So nothing is formulated, nothing is, in the bag already, everything's open, other than, as Sarah mentioned, we have to look at it under the lens of that this is a historic site. So if you want a Ferris wheel, we're not going to have a Ferris wheel because that wouldn't be approved. So then I think Sarah has, in a much more eloquent way than I will have, described the local historic site and what that means to us. Single site, single structure, historic site. So beyond that, in terms of the historic significance, tonight we also want to talk about how do we make this a better park. So what you see out there now was designed in 1903 for 1903 uses. Think of what Somerville was like in 1903. And we'll actually Danielle will show you some maps in terms of streetcars and that kind of thing. But it's a very different place. It's very dense, highly used. So does the park do all the things that you want it to do? So that's a good question for tonight. And is it accessible to all the different people who want to use it? Is the turf what we want it to be? No. And then what about managing vegetation or safety and lighting, that kind of thing? So these are the kind of things we are on our list that we think will be improved, but we want to reinforce that with you. All right, so that is my brief introduction. Danielle is going to shift gears and really build on what Sarah was talking about in terms of the history of the site, and in a brief way explain the history, not as a professor will. If you want to dive into this deeper, this will be available online, and you'll be able to really kind of scrutinize it. Why is this moving on its own? So I will quit talking and let Danielle talk about the history, and then I'll be back later.
Good evening. Just raise a hand or something if I'm not speaking loud enough, please. So as Kyle mentioned and Sarah mentioned and Louisa mentioned, there's a lot of history on this site. And that's a big part of what makes it so important and so hopefully revered by those of you in the community. So we're going to I'm going to do a quick run through from geological evolution to today, if you'll indulge me for a moment here. Page, right?
This one.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Let's try that again. So the site is a hill, right? Prospect Hill. Going back to geological formation, this is drumlin. It's these types of hills were formed by glacial advance and retreat, which is left behind gravel, glacial erratics, large stones. Very similar if you imagine Spectacle Island and the 2 humps that it has. It's the same type of formation. And some of the maps actually show the other hills, some maps that I have up later, show some of the other hills in the area, and you can see the way they're very striated, the way it's formed by the glacial retreat. The soils in these hills tend to be very sandy and gravelly. Which means they're well drained, which is good, so water will move quickly through it. And traditionally, these hills were used for crop cultivation or pasturage, which is in fact what exactly Prospect Hill is used for a couple different eras. These hills are very often in the northeast, are forested with red and white oaks, gray birches, red maples,
and eastern white pines, some of our great northeast trees. So looking at the first inhabitants, we know that in this area, we're going back about 12,000 years. The Massachusetts Federation is the first inhabitants of our area. Very often, these what we call pre-contact sites were very near fresh water because one, they have fresh water for drinking, and two, a food source or multiple food sources with fish and shellfish. Prospect Hill is about a mile from the Mystic River and a mile and a half from the Charles River, so it's a little bit remote for us to have any potential for archaeological resources. And in fact, early in the spring of this year, Public Archaeology Laboratory did an archaeological survey for the site and did in fact find, based on the remoteness from freshwater and previous disturbance on the site, there is very little likelihood of significant findings, is the technical term. But however, it is worth noting that there is some record showing that Washington Street was actually likely an ancient way that skirts the bottom of Prospect Hill, so that has a lot of significance at the bottom of the hill. So, looking at the colonial era, starting about 1500, thereabouts, a little bit later in our parts, the Prospect Hill area was part of what they call a stinted common, which just means it was divided up. So this is a 250-acre common. So if you think of Boston Common and expand upon that, I don't even know the size of Boston Common, but significant. It essentially stretched. So Somerville was historically part of Charlestown. If you imagine the Charlestown line today and take that all the way to Elm Street, which is just a little to our west, I believe, that would have been part of this common. So the common pasturage for people to let their livestock graze. And that was used that way until about 1685. And so each of these maps, they're probably pretty tough to see, but there's an orange. This one. Wrong. So there's going to be an orange circle on each map that shows the approximate area of what we're looking at Prospect Hill. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about Revolutionary War times, and that really is what gives Prospect Hill its significance. The Siege of Boston lasted about a year, from 1775 to 1776. Evacuation Day, also St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, was when the British left Boston. But as part of it, there's innumerable maps of Boston area during that 1775, 1776 era. And every single one of those maps that I've seen all have Prospect Hill denoted in some way or another. Fortifications on the hill began immediately after the Battle of Concord and Lexington. They started at around Washington Street at the base of the hill, and then they worked them a little bit, but then shortly thereafter, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, which would happen in June 1775, they immediately began fortifying all the hills, knowing that, of course, the battle for the high ground is always the desired land, so you can have strategic advantage. So they began fortifying Prospect Hill, Winter Hill in earnest. And once George Washington arrived and took command of the army in July, he began adding to it as well. So they started referring to the site as the Citadel. It connected Prospect and Central Hills with a rampart and a trench. And it was considered the strongest of the Revolutionary War fortifications in Boston. So it's very significant. And if you're a history buff, you'll know the name General Israel Putnam. He had a large part to do with the fortifications. He also took command of Prospect Hill. Throughout the duration, the Prospect Hill and the encampment there, they housed over 4,000 troops, so it was significant for that also. And then even after the evacuation of the British, come 1776, there were surrendered British soldiers who were actually held on the site too. So I'll just quickly go through some of these maps. This one's my favorite because it shows the troops marching back and forth, and red, of course, is British, and blue is the Patriots. Again, it's labeled in orange here either as this is Prospect Hill, but also Mount Pisgah. The Citadel or Prospect Mount, it is here. But you can see it's a significant fortification. And these are both British and Patriot maps. It worked. Thank you. And so this is a map of the actual fortifications themselves and a little sketch that was done by British troops of Prospect Hill and the fortifications. So it really was substantial. And if you imagine, this would be close to where Prospect Hill, the park now, and this would actually have been Washington Street at the base of the hill.
Can I just point out one thing? That top grade, though, is not where the park is now.
Correct. Right. If you can go to the next one. Thank you. So as America established itself as an independent nation, they no longer needed the fortifications in the same way. So Prospect Hill actually went into service. There was a grist mill established on the hill. And then in 1835, the Boston and Lowell Railroad came through. So again, the orange is Prospect Hill, and this is where I was talking. You can see the way the glacial movement went back and forth. So you have these long, skinny hills. But this is the Boston and Lowell Railroad. So with the railroad coming in 1835, spurred development, and Prospect Hill became a very desirable community, residential community at the top of the hill. In 1842, Somerville was established as its own town with a little more than 1,000 residents, which tripled very quickly. And by 1903, I think there was 65,000, so it expanded quite readily. And then, of course, there's another railroad coming through further south. But the Boston and Lowell really spurred the development of the hill itself. And then Boston and Monroe Streets on either side were laid out in 1842 as well. So Civil War era, some of the fortifications were actually still visible on site because there hadn't been a lot of development on portions of the hill that we see now. The park is developed, or where the park is, excuse me. But during the Civil War, the Somerville Guard would come and encamp on Prospect Hill before they were heading south to fight in the Civil War. Shortly thereafter, if you want to skip to the next one, there were two residences. This is the gray area. This is from that PAL archaeological report, but the gray area is essentially the park landscape now, and there are two houses in yellow, one here and one here. So the land got divided up into residential, and then the tower is approximately in that location now. As Louisa mentioned, the hill is not at its original height. In 1873, 1874, they started taking the land literally away from the hill in order to fill Miller's River. And some of you may know the story that there was a lot of slaughterhouses in Somerville. It was part of the big industry, and a lot of the debris and detritus was going directly into Miller's River. So it was stagnant and it was quite fetid. So they started filling it in, and all that earth to do that came off of Prospect Hill. So there's an anecdotes that say that the height of the tower, which is about 30 feet high, that is about the top of where the Prospect Hill used to be, the actual height. And the only the center of the hill remained intact, which is about where what we're looking at now, where the park is now. Yes, thank you. So, so fast forward to 1896. We're in the colonial revival era, which kind of was kicked off by a centennial exposition in 1876. So it was 1 year after independence was declared. Kind of spurred on this love affair, if you will, for colonial history and all things Washington and Boston's role, of course, in that revolutionary history. So in 1896, Prospect Hill Park Association was established to do something with this parcel of land. And 2 years later, Somerville Historical Society was established. So again, beginning to understand the city's role in the Revolutionary War, and trying to make something of that and celebrate that. So the park was then designed in 1902. The tower itself was dedicated in 1903. You can see, we have other images, but there's a very steep slope originally underneath the tower. And because of very sandy soils that in the 1950s started to slough off. So that's why we now have those retaining walls that are holding that, the tower and the slope up. There was restoration done, or was it renovation, added the overlook and a lot of the granite work that's out there was done in 1982. And then Sarah mentioned the fact that the tower is listed. The tower itself, the structure, is listed on the Massachusetts Registry for Historic Places. It was listed in 1992. In 2011, that local historic district was created. And then, of course, the tower was restored in 2015, and here we are today, if you want to scroll through the next few photos. So this is a map. This was done by the man who did, an engineer who did the planting plan for the park. This map shows the site in 1898, again, substantial fortifications. This is Road to Cambridge, showing off the 1775. And then this is before 1901, 1902, before the tower was constructed, but they had regraded the site substantially. So you see that significant mound. Here, this would be about where Prospect Hill Parkway is today. It didn't exist at that point. And this is them putting it in later. So you can see, again, this is where the tower would be. These stairs are still there. This wall is still there. So a lot hasn't changed, a whole bunch. Yeah. So this is a great photo of the dedication. It looks like that's not the concrete wall. I keep thinking that is, but that's actually the slope and just the hordes of people up on the site. There is, you can't tell, but there is a railing up there. And I love the tent use on the lawn space. Go ahead. Because of colonial revival, again, they're trying to celebrate, the city's trying to celebrate everything they have. So there are postcards galore of historic images of the site, which are fantastic. And if ever you want to see, there's a great website called cardcow.com. Funny name, but it has great historic postcards that are a great resource for us. But all sorts of views of the site in the earliest 20th century. And then this is the image, so we're talking about, this is 1954, before that retaining wall was built. You can see the walkway is collapsing, has collapsed, and the sandy soils, you can see that's all just completely sloughing off. So now that's why we have the concrete walls that we have there now. And then I'm not sure if this is the first time that they celebrated, which I didn't even mention, of course, January 1st, George Washington was present, if not party to, the raising of the Grand Union flag on the site as kind of to the British troops in the harbor. So they raised the Grand Union flag, which does have, of course, the crosses of St. Andrew and I forget the other one, with the 13 stripes, the red and white stripes. So this is considered the first American flag. So I believe in 1975 might be the first time that tradition was started, and then carried it through since. So I'm going to give it back to Kyle for a few minutes.
Thanks, Danielle. Hopefully that was either a refresher for a lot of you, or maybe you learned a lot. I think that gives a good context for the importance of this site. So we're going to shift gears. I mentioned we also want to make sure this is a successful park for today's use. And what are the things that really play into what makes a successful park? It starts with people, and how do people feel comfortable and safe there? So, there are things like, the recreational opportunities, there's safety, accessibility, and comfort. And then there's placemaking. How is this place unique and how is it of that place? And I think a lot of what Danielle was talking about is what makes this distinct and different than other places. You want to? Yep. So we've done an existing conditions analysis. So we go out as landscape architects and look at how the site is used. We look at the vegetation, but also the views and other resources. So I'm going to walk through each one of these, and it's also a way to kind of prime the pump for comments to talk about some of these different things. You all know the site. You may not be used to looking at it this way, an aerial view directly down, and the tower is always the place to start in terms of, where are we? And then of course the park is bounded by Prospect Hill Parkway, Monroe Street, but that generally is the park. Next slide. So we've tried to oversimplify how the park is used. So there is the tower and observatory. Hopefully all of you have been up at some point. It's because it's an interesting view, perspective of the park, but also regionally. But then how else is the park used? There's an overlook here. People sit in the shade generally on benches. There's footrests at a few spots. If you really look in the corner, there's a bronze medallion kind of telling you about some of the views related to the battle. Then there is a lawn that's kind of the counterpoint to the overlook. There's not that structured seating there, but still well used in a very flexible way. Then we have a slope downhill of the tower. It's not real functional, but I imagine when the sun's out, people gather down there. There's still kind of an interesting view. There's a few kind of craggy apple trees down there. And then another slope that is heavily wooded is in this area, and we have a couple walkways going down in through that stretch. And then how is this? Oh, sorry. And then it's all tied together with the sidewalk through here. So each one of these categories I'm going to use as an organizer to show more photos and talk about specific issues. So the first one will be the lawn. Yep. That is a good question. We've asked that same question internally. We think, maybe it was used for storage at some point. We're not exactly sure. We've seen a wooden version of it in photos. I can't pinpoint exactly when the stone one came, but I think, we'd like your comments on that tonight. Does anybody think that should be reused, or should it be removed or repurposed or whatever? Yep.
Or does anyone remember when it was built?
So the lawn itself, and I'm talking about the one that's not the overlook, it's got a nice axial relationship with the tower. There's that view shed there. As Danielle mentioned, this used to be the top of the hill. It still is the top of the hill, although it's very different. And there's a profile on this lawn that's very pronounced. And it's meant really for a passive use. You're not gonna, you could kick a soccer ball here, but it's gonna wind up down the hill pretty quickly. And then, trees frame this. A mixed bag of trees too. You have black locust, which are considered invasive, and then you have a number of different things on this side. Products of different time periods, some deliberately planted in the 80s, some not deliberately planted. And then there's other things in terms of lighting. We have more of a roadway type light here that shows up also here. And we want to look at the benches again, because in some cases, are they really in the right spot from a comfort standpoint? Here, I don't really think I want to sit with my back right up against the sidewalk, and it's not really providing any shade. So everything's up for grabs as long as we think about it as a historic site. So next up, the woods that are on the slope there. You have a sloping path that makes its way down, and there's a set of stairs. It's a shortcut. But it's a challenging part of the site, because there's some condition issues, retaining wall that's falling, and the handrail that's attached to it is not stable anymore. There's stairs that aren't in great condition. The mystery building that we've already mentioned. But there's also evidence of TLC from the community. There's concern about erosion, but you're using natural materials there to make a branch wattle that's habitat and erosion control, so that's a good sign. Yep. So then if we keep making our way around, so Louisa got us to the top of the tower, which was a great way to kind of start the project for us and get this unique perspective looking down on the park and the plaza below. But a lot of people experience the tower just by coming up the stairs and are limited to this concrete plaza. And you can get pretty good views there, and in some cases there's a concrete wall, in other cases there are these cutouts where a railing is. There also is this, beyond that, there's this lawn panel that if you jump the wall, you can hang out there, and a lot of people do. But that's something, we want to hear your feedback. I want to be out there, or no, people shouldn't be there. So that's important for us to hear. And then there is vegetation around these walls, of different qualities. That's not maybe putting the best face forward, but that's something we're going to improve on. And then the overlook. It's designed in 1982, where cobblestone was definitely, something harkening back to historic materials. This is not handicap accessible. But these trees are a product of that time period as well. They're Norway maples. Again, that's an invasive tree, but providing good shade. So it's not something that we're going to say, oh, we have to get rid of immediately. But we wouldn't replace it with a Norway maple because it's illegal. You can't actually buy Norway maples in the state anymore. And then, there's a mixed bag of site furniture here, which benches, bike racks, and things that we just need to question. Is this still current and valid today, or do we need to think about how the community will use this park, acknowledging that this is a great viewing spot and has good shade. The slope itself, what's the best use of that site? And is this something we should mow regularly, or can it turn into some other kind of vegetation? And there's other kind of condition issues in terms of the walkway, the fence. People do walk at the base of the wall. It's kind of a shortcut. And is that something we want to promote and formalize or block off? So that's the kind of thing we want to hear about too. And then there's the streetscape. And we would love to have really successful street trees. And it's a challenge anywhere in the city, but there are things that we can do to really give them the best chance. But this is a pretty narrow planting condition, so we're going to decide, do we want to plant here, or do we plant at the back of the sidewalk where there's more soil? Also provide irrigation likely as part of this, so we'll have a water source. But then again, question the use of cobblestone, which aren't accessible, grow weeds and are harder to maintain in a lot of cases, and maybe aren't allowing water and air transmission to some of those trees. And again, site furnishings that may have been appropriate in 1982, but now we have to look and see, this isn't a handicap accessible drinking fountain anymore, so that's something we need to make current. And on the topic of accessibility, Danielle will kind of I'll pass the baton to her. If we go to the next slide, she'll talk about accessibility in the park in general and our challenges there.
So as part of our site assessment, we did look at the grades on site. So there's a number of things that affect accessibility in a landscape. And specifically here, we've done a study for the stairs and any of the paths and the sidewalks around the site. So might be tough to read the key there, but anything that's yellow meets the ADA, which is the American with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines. So we call it ADAG. But ADA, anything that's yellow meets ADA codes. So you can see, even along the sidewalk, Kyle pointed out the cobblestones do not meet code. So we have sidewalk from here to here, and then where the cobbles are, no longer accessible. And then you have a connection here, and you can get, partway down the slope or partway into the green space. But even here, you've got a little bit of steep slopes. So it's just, there's a lot of challenge. One, because if it's a hill, and short of putting something like this, like a lift, up to the tower portions of the site, it's a challenge. But what our goal would be to make as much of the site accessible as possible, or at least creating an accessible experience for the park. So we're looking at how do you get there if you're not coming by automobile. So technically, this sidewalk, because it follows the street grade, is accessible, even though it's steep. And any of the stairs, they don't meet accessibility code. So we looked at that, and then if you can go to the next one, shows some of the images again, the cobblestones, because they create tripping hazards, the steep grades on a lot of the walkways, really steep here, and just the heaving pavement and the bituminous, that's the pathway that follows Prospect Hill on the park side. And then, so at this point, we know that this is at least the minimum of what we can probably do for the site. One is to likely reestablish some sort of overlook, if that's something that the community wants, and we can make that fully accessible. So removing those cobblestones and making a space, if it's there, or if it's here, wherever that is, provides an opportunity to see the view from the base of the tower. Definitely creating that entire sidewalk, not only with street trees, to make that fully accessible. And then the lawn space, the big lawn space where you can get into and use for passive recreation, because we know that there are likely no significant findings in terms of archaeology, we can do a little bit of regrading without completely redeveloping the site, so that we can provide a more complete accessible experience. And then as far as safety as well, we're looking at, we've got crosswalks here, but does it make sense from a safety aspect to have other connections into the park? So we've talked about the early plan. This is the 1902 planting plan. And so for the park plans, we really only have, there are a couple sketches from the engineer of the tower, Ernest Bailey. He was the city engineer at the time, who designed the tower. And then we have this planting plan that does show the pathways, which you'll notice are very similar to what we have today. So we've taken a look at this planting plan. Of course, it's 1902, so plantings are a little bit different. You want to switch to the next one, please? This is the list of all the plant species that are in that planting plan. They're color-coded to an extent, so anything that's red on that list is an invasive species. So like Kyle mentioned, the Norway maples, even if we wanted to, we couldn't plant those. They're not available, and they're too aggressive. So there are other aggressive species, like bittersweet, privets. They're also, and the blue is non-desirable, which Lombardy poplar is a great tree. It does not belong in the site or probably anywhere in this region, in my opinion. And then green are some of the species that are still on the site today. And the red maple that are on site today, but they're used as street trees, so this wouldn't be the same red maples that were there historically. However, a fair amount of the shrub plantings, are still present, whether they're still from 1903 or it's the next generation. There are very similar shrub plantings there. So this is, again, we're back to the aerial, but this is today's conditions. These are the trees that we have on site today. So we have one fabulous American elm in the corner. We've got the apple trees coming through here. This stretch, we've got a whole cluster of black locust, which is both a native and an invasive species. But because it is invasive, we can't plant it. That takes up that cluster there. And then the entire wooded area is two species, and it's black locust and Norway maple. Both are invasives. And then along the street, we have some red maples, one plane tree. There's a couple of junior, we'll say, elms coming up in that shrub cluster, which is fantastic. And then the big trees, with the exception of one, the big trees on the overlook area are also Norway maples. And again, they're providing great shade. They could use a little encouragement. But so that's something we have to look at. Do we take those down just because they're invasives, or do we keep them so we have some shade? So the black locust and the invasive trees, do we necessarily have to get rid of them? Or can we just not plant them going forward? And that's exactly correct. So we cannot plant an invasive species, but if they're there and we deem that they're not doing any harm, we can maintain them. And that's part of the decision-making process that we'll go through as part of this. Same with the large Norway maples, because they're providing shade, they're still providing a benefit. So this is the species that are on the site today, much smaller than the previous list. A few, the black locust, and then we also have the barberry, which is a fair amount of the shrub species that are in the clusters at the edge of the walkways, and then a few native species in there and a couple other species. So much smaller plant palette than was there in 1902. So this is just look at some of the quick trees. Again, that fantastic elm at the corner there. These are the young elms coming up in that shrub area, red maple on the street, and those big Norway maples. So from vegetation, and again, having spoken about the history. Kyle mentioned the plaque that's up at the edge there, at the edge of the overlook. That is a great interpretive element, and I think even if it doesn't stay in that location, it'll probably more than likely stay on site because it is a great component. There are a lot of other things taking the rundown of the siege of Boston, and so we've kind of done this visual connection so here's our site, Prospect Hill, and then all the other significant sites of the siege of Boston, so Old North Church, South Church, Castle Island, Dorchester Heights, Bunker Hill, Washington's headquarters in Cambridge. So just looking at how they relate, because we do have this prospect and we have the tower, so what, and thinking about views and view sheds kind of ties into that vegetation conversation, and can we clean up some of the view sheds or frame some of the views or selectively manage the trees that are there so we can get some of these key views back. We won't be able to get them all from the ground level for sure, but we can look at some of that, and certainly as you move up the tower, which if you go to the next view, we can look at doing something. So this is the views from the ground level. You've got the vegetation on the playground that's across the way that we'll be looking at some of that too. So this is clearly the area for the overlook. There's a great reason why the overlook is there. You've got the views, and this is from a little bit further out. But you're facing towards Boston, and you've got this walkway, which is just on the right side of the tower, but you've got the whole cluster of trees blocking the long view down the hill. And then this is the upper level where you can get to, it's always open, of the tower. You've got great shot of the city skyline. Cambridge, not so much. So we'll be looking at how we can maybe open up some of those views and kind of reconnect that history, even if through a visual connection. And then at the very top, when we were up there, was one of those very foggy mornings, but we could just see as it went on at the base of Bunker Hill and Zakim Bridge, we knew they were off in that direction. Some of the views, like Bunker Hill, on the kind of mid-level, the level you can always get to, because of the residences in this area will be blocked from view from that lower level. So that's a challenge. But I do think, and on that accessibility conversation, I meant to point out that the city already has that great. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's a video on the city website that provides an interpretive opportunity for people who are mobility impaired and can't get up the tower, but it kind of gives them a curated story about the tower and the site itself. So it's a great step for accessibility. And then we talked a little bit about the granite. There's frankly a lot of money in all this granite on site. So this is something we want to look at reusing. We've got all the seat walls that are there, granite, the cobbles and the granite sets, the bollards, and like kind of the footrests there. So if we can, we would probably look at reusing these somehow on site because it's a great resource. So that's our spiel. Now I want to hear from you so we can stop talking and get a drink of water and have some input.
So thank you that was a long history lesson, but I think much better than watching television. So questions, comments? I have to hand you the microphone because it gets on the film. So please just let me know when you would like to speak. Tori, can you pass this back, please? Thanks.
So I think I would like to start with the concrete wall that has nothing historic. That is pretty ugly. I mean, seen from our house, it's really bad. And seen when you approach the tower, it just takes everything from the view of the tower. What are you going to do about that concrete wall? I mean, I'm aware that you need to keep it, but is there something that you are going to do with the vegetation or with the community to make it better?
I think everybody feels the same way about those walls. Unfortunately, they are serving a function, but I think that what I'm hearing you is think of some creative ways to make it better.
Yeah.
That's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, break. yeah, something or the cobblestone. Or yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And we move the lightning that goes to that concrete wall.
The
The
lighting.
Yeah.
I have a thought on that note. If we were to have some climbing vines going along that, that would really beautify that, and that would limit a lot of the light bouncing off. It would just have something to diffuse.
Periodically, we get the graffiti, you know, so having something decorative.
Oh, on the wall. No.
Or anything else for that matter.
For me, it's lighting. I'm a neighbor of the park, and I walk up that ramp coming home from Union Square, and it is dark at night, and a little bit iffy going up the ramp at night. And I tend to use the stairs instead, but we do need to get some better lighting in there for sure.
There are summer residents that live in the woods. We have folks who live in the woods, and that is an issue with the bathroom issue at that little the shed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The smoke. Yeah, the yoga shed.
Yeah. About the lighting, we live right literally at the foot of the hill. We think that there is way too much lighting, and that the way it is now, it doesn't really add value to the park. That if you are going to put some different lighting or more lighting, we would like to see the park and the nature being highlighted by that. We haven't seen any safety issues.
But you're saying that you would like to see the lighting focus on
maybe on the shrub, on the nature in the park, and directly on the tower.
Okay.
But not bright in our eyes when we look from the overlook.
So I'm hearing two things. One is that we need better lighting for safety, but the lighting that's there now is harsh and doesn't serve the purpose of highlighting the site or
The street lighting is incredibly bright.
Okay.
And it eliminates any view of Boston if you're actually on the tower or looking out at night. And the paths to get up aren't well lit. So there's a really well lit street light that's blinding everybody, and then there's not well lit paths at all. So the paths need to be better lit, and that street light, if it could be dimmed or aimed in a different way so
that's
that
just
it's
one
not
light
blinding.
that you're.
So like,
Before you leave,
there's a
tell
few,
me,
but
tell
there's
me
like,
that one
yeah.
light.
There's one that always gets me, but I'm sure there's more than the one that are all the street lights, though.
So there.
Necessary for safety for people walking along the street there when they're walking their dogs and such like that?
I don't think it needs to be that bright. I think it could be still pretty bright and focused in a different way that it's not blinding everyone in the neighborhood.
So I've gotten two things to ask you about with lighting. One is someone had sent me an email saying that on the 4th of July, the uplighting prohibits people from seeing the fireworks. I think that, in internal conversations, we have said there is a need to uplight the flag at least, because that is but do people also feel like it sounds like the uplighting that's there now is maybe too harsh and not well directed. And the good news is there's been a lot of change in lighting technology, so those are things that I think can be achievable in a different way. The second thing I wanted to kind of take your pulse on is that I know that the Arts Council had been talking about possibly having lights that change color or uplight that. What do you guys, again, this has to go through historic, and I think that their purview is not as strong as in other things because it's not something permanent, but is that something you would want to see the tower change colors on
Right, exactly.
Jason, can I jump in? Because one of the things I've observed from some of your other recent projects is that when you have the staff capacity and the consulting capacity, we have the ability now to, I think, take some of the things that we've heard and visualize them quickly and early in the process. So before we've gone down a road of months and months and tens of thousands of dollars of fees, the team can get some of these ideas captured and just quickly rendered or visualized. And obviously, you know, you can take that to the crazy degree, and you can spend big budgets and do really fine-grained stuff. But I think for quick studies and kind of quick visualizations to say, hey, is this directionally, strategically, is this consistent with what you were telling us? And obviously, it's not just what we hear tonight, but the conversations you folks have on the street, and then feedback we get over on email and whatnot. But that's part of the work plan, I assume, whether it's about treatments for that concrete wall or various lighting solutions.
Okay, on that, what you were calling, was it the terrace, where you can kind of, that grassy area? On that grassy area, and this isn't a judgment, but people do sleep there in the summer on that grassy area. And sometimes people drink on that level or other stuff. And so in the mornings, early mornings, when I'm up there with the dog, you know, people sometimes try to jump off that. And that's really a danger. I don't know what you can do in terms of protecting that a little bit. That level, there's no, you know, it must be at least 12 feet up, and there's no protection there at all.
It's very popular on the 4th of July.
Yeah, and you know, kids go up there, and you know, I had to talk somebody to get off there at one point.
So this is the kind of issue that we have to look at and kind of consider all the nuance, because on the one hand, it was never intended to be used because it doesn't have it wouldn't have had safety things back then, but it should have safety components. But then there's also this element of when it's not being used incorrectly, it's also kind of a spontaneous thing that could be used, and it's really hard to balance that out. You know, we have that issue in our parks. Like if people are sleeping there, do we design defensively so that they can't, or do we recognize that?
No.
So that is something that
How to make it safer. People, we know people are up there.
Right.
That's the issue.
But why could they not be there and protect themselves? I mean,
Well, it's 12 feet, at least 12.
It's a varying heights around the sides, and I'm a rock climber. It's about 7-8 feet on like the two main sides that people climb up, and I climb up it almost every other day, and I don't have any safety issues with doing that.
Inebriated, do you do it?
I mean, like,
these are all
in
issues.
general,
There are issues with children being
Yeah.
on it. There are all
Yeah.
kinds of safety versus over safety. That's
but
something that we deal with in the landscape.
if people are drinking, they're not gonna.
That area is a nice area, following up on this issue, is that so many people go over the wall and they have a picnic and they hang out and they study, and it's just like such a nice community place. And the breeze up there in the summer is just like an incredible spot, and I feel like let's embrace it. It's a great place for the community. And if that's the focus here, then to consider how do you make it easier for people to get to, because right now they have to sort of like shimmy over the metal handrail, and that can be dangerous.
Well, so I think something Brandon is saying is true, is that people like to do dangerous things in the landscape. Children like to do dangerous things in the landscape. From a liability standpoint, it's not a good idea. From a we exist in the world standpoint, people have varying degrees of opinions on it. I think if we encourage folks to use that, then we also have to think about the safety issues. So it's one of these things of, it's been that way for 100 years, leave it alone, or we're going to promote it, but we have to make it safe. And sometimes it's hard to balance those two things out, but I think that's something that we can study and look at, for sure. Can you guys just pass the microphone, not because it projects your voice, but because it gets on the television?
Hi, I'm Tori. I have a flurry of thoughts. One regarding the need to have a bathroom there. I would love for you guys and the community to consider compostable toilets. We're putting one in at the Growing Center, and I think this was sort of the way towards sustainability, and you can make it pleasant looking versus having like a porta potty there. That shed, I think that's a great idea to reuse it. We're hopefully starting a land stewardship program in the city, and people are, friends of groups. We'd love to have that as a storage shed for tools. I mean, in my opinion, I'm sure there's lots of other things, but that'd be great. On one of the slides, I didn't see native plants, and that's sort of the bee in my bonnet, and the importance of restoring the ecosystem. And on one of the landscape designs you showed me had a lot of plants. They were Latin names, and a lot of, there was like 6 at least, something occidentalis. So that shows me that native plants were definitely historical, including Dutchman's pipe, which was huge in the Victorian era. And so we'll be establishing a native planting ordinance in the upcoming months. And I was hoping, we'll be able to come to some sort of agreement on the way we landscape and also what plants we use. And the Urban Forestry Committee is also going to be reestablished, so hopefully we'll be working with you closely on that as we have in an advisory capacity, on how we develop our parks. So those are some things that are really important to me and my goals. And this is wonderful. Thank you guys so much for presenting this. Your presentation has encouraged me a lot. So yeah, I'm sure I'll have more thoughts, but. Oh, and parkour. Parkour folks love Prospect Hill.
It's the different layers and the fact that it has multiple points of entry off and on and such. You're a rock climber, so you well know that. I mean, I have to say, and this is a question, I don't live in the neighborhood, but do people here really not want to continue to have that there? Because I think there are other people that aren't here today that would vehemently disagree with that. So
But when you say have that there, what is it specifically that you're asking?
Well, I think
the middle of the cake layer, that middle cake
right,
layer?
the cake, and if you put things up for safety so that people can't sleep up there or fall off when they're inebriated, as you're saying, and such, I mean, that adds a feature that's not really historic, for one, but secondly, it does make it so that it's not conducive to doing the things that a lot of people enjoy doing there. So I'm asking this as a question, whether or not people are offended or bothered by that, because, it's like the Powder House Park also has some of these kinds of features as well that makes it an interesting urban environment for young children all the way up through adults and such to use as a recreational resource. And so if we remove those things, then I think many people would say we're destroying one of the integrity of the park's enjoyment. So
the question isn't would we remove it? The question is if we're encouraging its use, then we have to make it safe. And those are two kind of different things. It either stays as it is and is being used as it's not intended because people like to use it that way, or it is intended for that use and then we have certain safety guidelines and laws that we have to follow. So it's a little bit of balancing that. What is the intended use and what is it then designed for?
I think
Can we do a temperature check on your question? Can we do a temperature check?
if the mayor was here today, he would tell you the story about what he used to do when he was a kid growing up here. And I don't think that that's something that he wants to see. And I don't want to speak for the mayor, but he relays a story with great fondness about his childhood there. So I understand.
So I think it's a question. I think it's one that many people, and let me tell you, having designed numerous playgrounds, people fall in very different places about safety and landscape use. I think it's something that we can explore. I think we can certainly, do a little straw poll, but it's something I think we can look into. If we encourage its use in that way, what does the safety stuff look like? If we leave it as it is, what does that look like? But I think the big issue that I'm hearing a lot of consensus is the wall's ugly, make it look better. The lighting has some issues. Think about that. Are there other things that direct our research and thinking.
Hi, I'm Katie. I live on Prospect Hill Ave, and want to thank you for your presentation. It was very informative, and I'm excited about the project and the direction it's going in. I just wanted to speak from the perspective as a parent with 3 kids who live in the area. Sorry. I have 3 young kids, and they love going to the park. Some of the aspects that I think are important to us are the area that you described as the woods has the pathway in it, and I feel like for kids growing up in an urban area, to have anywhere that they can go and feel like they're in the middle of a forest and have a bit of a fantasy about fairies and woods and things is really cool. And so the pathways that are in there and the amount of trees that are there, I really think is fabulous, and I'd love to see as much of that stay as possible. I understand the need for creating the views, but I just hope it will be balanced with the very few trees that we have in Somerville and trying to keep as many of them as possible. And we also really enjoy the grassy area for throwing a ball, and so I'm excited to see that remain a passive grassy area. There's one shrub there that the kids really like to use as a fort. I don't know how that rates in terms of a health of a plant, but it's a big shrub that you can kind of go inside, and it's hollow in the middle. And I think a lot of the kids in the neighborhood really enjoy that space. So we would like to see that stay. And, I think in terms of changes, I'm happy to see that there's thought being put into the connection between the park and the neighborhood. And I would love it if we could use this opportunity to create even one of those crosswalks to be a raised crosswalk to reduce the speed along the street going on Monroe. I know there's a lot of thought going into traffic calming, and that's a tricky thing in terms of the traffic and parking budget. And so I think if there's any way we could use this opportunity to get one raised crosswalk, that would be great. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Folks don't kind of constrain their creativity when they think about traffic calming. We launched a calming program, a petition process. You and many of your neighbors have filed petitions with our office. Our program manager, Adam, sits 2 seats away from Louisa in our office and on our team. So kind of the interdepartmental, interdivisional, interdisciplinary approach is an important one here. When we do a park project, it's an opportunity to have a conversation about sidewalks and about traffic calming. And I actually really want to make sure that folks know that to the points about ADA and about viable tree planting sites along Monroe, don't think that just because a granite curb is there today, that it has to be in that exact location at the end of this project. We can bump it into the street. We actually, of course, have to observe certain traffic standards, but frankly, we know from your advocacy that cars are moving too fast, and there are too many of them, and they're moving too fast. And one of the most proven ways to slow cars down is to have skinnier streets, narrower streets, with narrower lane widths. So if we can grab an extra foot or two of the street and still achieve all our mobility and accessibility needs, and that helps calm traffic and create more viable planting sites and help us address historic preservation, the cobbles, as well as ADA compliance, I think it's a win-win for a lot of folks. So I just want to make sure that people go away from this meeting knowing that we're willing to talk about those streets on the edges of the forest.
Yes.
One thing that I'm sorry. One thing that is really important to me thinking about the future is succession planting, like thinking about which trees are going to be coming up and how they're going to be benefiting each other as they're doing that. And I know right now, like the big slope is just mowed clear every year, and that's increasing a lot of the erosion there, which will over time slump down the hill even more, and you'll have to put in another wall. And that could be avoided with planting intelligently.
Does that actually get mowed? Have you seen people mowing it?
Yeah. And that's probably the part of the whole park, in my opinion, that looks like it's not doing the best.
I would like to go back to the traffic and the traffic at the bottom of the stairs. We spend our entire summer outside. We see what is going on there. It's terrible. I mean, the cars are going down where the pedestrians and kids are coming down the stairs, and there is really no space for the kids to land, or and to make sure that the cars will stay away from them. But also there are a lot of pedestrians who come along our house and then they cross the street to go to the steps, and there is nothing there. It's in a turn. The cars are coming down, up, and I mean, I like to hear what you had to say, and I hope that this will be an opportunity to make the park safer and accessing to the park. The same way there is a playground across the street where you think about putting a raised bed. I mean, is that playground part of a safety plan in terms of the park?
So the playground is not part of this park project,
yeah.
but crossing to the playground is not off the table. Making that a
Okay.
safer crossing
Okay.
is not off the table.
Crosswalk there help at that little,
Yeah, or narrowing
right there
the
at that
street, or
at the elbow.
it would help, but I think narrowing the street would help, widening the sidewalk, especially when the steps land on the sidewalk, and yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So there are a number.
Adding trees there.
Yeah, there are a number of things that I think
Yeah.
we need to look at in terms of, again, the street treatment isn't necessarily part of the park, but I think in conjunction with the traffic calming program, we can look at what parts can be incorporated into the park construction, what parts can be built separately or as the part of traffic calming.
It might be nice to have a bench on this end, on the Walnut Street end of the park. There's no bench at all.
Hi, I'm Sam. I live on Monroe and Bigelow, and thank you all for such a thoughtful presentation and for soliciting our input. So what I look over the lawn and the woods, and I think the only thing I could add, aside from you guys should talk with Andrew, because he's like more than any other human, like knows the park and how humans interact with it, and I'm happy to connect you with him. The shed is like the source of nuisance / bad behavior. So people are sort of hidden from street view there. So, you know, I've had to call the police on people who OD there. Yeah. People spend the night there, use it as a toilet. So, you know, when the police drive by, they can't see that. And it's also just, you know, meet me at the shed. It's a place, I think, where people can congregate for that reason. So I don't know, through lighting or through removing it or through making it more visible from the street. But if you could think of ways in your design to, from that sort of public safety nuisance perspective, deal with that shed area, I think you'd deal with a lot of the bad behavior that goes on in the park. Also, the trash bins, I'm assuming, would be upgraded, but the current ones there overflow during like peak activity, and then trash blows everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, we have a taker. I loved your idea about thinking about succession and that eroding slope. I think it would be great to continue the forest into that area to plant the canopy, get some a meadow going. I love having a love affair with staghorn sumac right now, which is, you know, so again, not just thinking about the trees and the turf, but remembering that, you know, the forest ecology is the entire thing. So, you know, using that space, which is just kind of, you know, we're wasting money on maintenance right now, like just to make it sustainable, and that's easy enough. And I see that the shed could be, it's like part nuisance. It's kind of like the danger of the tower. Like me and my girlfriends go there and like do yoga and hang out and like chant, you know? So it's like I totally see your point, and hopefully we can make it more safe. But it's like this dual, like it can be used for good or for ill, and it's I just see so much potential there. So that'd be, you know, hopefully we can have a robust conversation about that. Well, I'd love to see it as a place where people who want to work in the park can go, like, get their tools. So maybe activating it more would be a way to sort of discourage people from bad behavior. Again, making it more sort of a part of the a use of the park, sort of a functional space. Yeah, no, it'd be a lock on it. There'd be a passcode. People, you know, who would want to work on it could access it. And again, I use it for yoga and meditation, and so it's I don't know. Maybe there's something we could activate it to encourage that use. You know, I don't know, like have it be a sometimes performance area for kids to put on a play or adults to put on a play.
People use that path and we're afraid of it.
If it were better, yeah, some nicer. Yeah, it is dark and yeah, so maybe we can work on that. Yeah, I do hope we can improve the lighting. I mean, I really want to improve the lighting throughout the city as we find more and more that, the American Medical Association is coming out against the blue light LED lighting. So attenuating that, and I love the creative idea about getting color in and focusing on the tower more than sort of this, light pollution of lights sort of, being dispersed up into the sky. So
I don't want to take the conversation away from the park itself, but one of the things that I heard Danielle talking about is the view from the hill out in various directions, and the brass or bronze plaque or whatever it is. I'm wondering whether that study takes into account the Union Square development that is going to be taking place one way or another. And in that context, I want to put in a plug for the Union Square Neighborhood Council. We're using the Union Square neighborhood plan boundaries as our definition of Union Square. And I have some flyers, and I think Andy, who I see sitting back there, has some more, so make sure you get one of these. So this is one of the kind of things that we're concerned about, especially people living on the hill, is what various buildings might do to the view from their own residence or from the park. So, with that said...
One thing that we do have to keep in mind is that those important views that Danielle had shown a map of, many of them, I would say most of them, are no longer visible because you have Boston that grew. So we're going to have to find a way to tell folks what those views are, where those historic sites are, but we're not necessarily making a literal view shed connection because it's not possible. So we have to keep the Union Square development in mind, but we also have to keep in mind that that map is not a literal one. You can no longer see most of those sites because Boston has grown up.
And to that point, Louisa, Gary, just to honor what you're saying, we can get Dan Barton and Melissa Woods, the team from, again, 5 desks down, who worked with you all and your neighbors for 3 years on the neighborhood planning process, and have done many of those visualizations to be here the same way that we're talking about interdisciplinary planning on traffic calming academy on one night, for example. So we want to make sure that we create that forum, that opportunity, either in physical meetings or in kind of remote participation, digital and otherwise. We can get those models that have been developed and make sure they're informing Kyle's work.
Right, but
and the view shed management really is going to be done by vegetation management, right? We are going to have to see, are we curating a certain view? Does a tree need to be trimmed in a certain way? Those are really the things that we have to do. We can't knock down the Hancock building so that we can see
the current
The impact on the horizon,
line.
close impact.
Of Boston, not like 17th century.
Yeah.
You're talking about the closer impact of those tall buildings planned. Is that what you're kind of?
Well, there are various considerations, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that people concerned about views might want to get involved in the conversation that is being had by the Union Square Neighborhood Council. I want to say one more thing about it, which is that we are accepting applications to be members of the steering committee of the Neighborhood Council up through Monday. I think that the version of the flyer that Andy and I have says it's tomorrow is the deadline, but we've extended it to Monday. The other thing I want to say about views and such, I naively went up to the top of the hill to see the fireworks last year, and I don't know if any of you have tried it, but there was this mad rush down the hill looking for a place where you could see through the houses, because up there it's not just the lighting that's blocking the view. There's something else, and the fireworks don't go that high.
What do you mean by something else? There's something else.
I don't remember what.
Trees.
Yeah, trees, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the, if you're standing on Corbett McKenna Park, you cannot really, there's an overlook, you can't really see anything anymore because the trees have taken over. And that's partly because the trees need to be pruned and taken care of in a regular way. It's also because there are a lot of invasive species that grow so quickly. So, part of the conversation is, for example, when Kyle was pointing the 3 Norway maples that are at the top in the overlook, that's an invasive tree. We wouldn't plant it today. But we, as a group, need to make a judgment. Are we going to take them down? Because they provide phenomenal shade, and there are all the benefits of a 20-plus-year-old tree, more than 20 years old.
Right.
So those are kind of things that we're going to have to come up with a vegetation management plan. We wouldn't want to go in and remove all the Norway maples.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't want to go in and remove everything that's there because they're providing a lot of important things. But we do need to start to look at them and come up with a management plan for how we're going to manage that tiny urban forest. And part of that is going to be trimming.
So I wasn't complaining. I wouldn't suggest massacring, a forest that has various benefits simply for one night a year, but
No,
so,
but it's not just a one night a year. You get very unique views from that vantage point, and so we're going to have to make decisions on which of those views are worth trimming trees. And then there are a lot of invasive trees that frankly need to be trimmed. They have not been trimmed since the 80s.
Thank you. Sure.
One thought that I had with regards to the historical, like you look in this direction, you have that thing. What if there were like plaques of what you used to see if you were looking in that direction? So you have something that would really appease to the historical interest, but recognizing the reality of what's grown up building and tree-wise in the area. Also, I had another completely unrelated thing that I wanted to say, which was companion planting with the trees and the different things that are coming to help ensure their success, because a lot of the black locusts that have come up, they're really opportunistic and they're nitrogen fixers, and so there's perhaps a reason why they've sprung up there with the soil being so poor and so sandy and everything.
Will you be on the Urban Forestry Committee?
Sure. Yeah.
It'd be nice to have evergreen.
Do I talk to you about that?
Well, there's something, I don't know if that's
Perfect.
in the picture, but something green that stays green in the winter, roadies or something.
I was just going to bring up the same point, and as a question is that the historic value of the site is very significant, obviously, and one way to deal with that is with a plaque. So I'm just wondering how people feel about adding plaques to that. Is that something a general consensus that people agree makes some sense? Because I'm sure you've all been to sites where they tell you what the view would have been if you looked out, in 1776, because we're never going to get that again unless we can take some buildings down in Cambridge and Boston, which is an interesting idea, but
unlikely.
But then, and that's the other thing about lighting, because another plan that was developed for this park once before had a lot more of those historic features brought out by doing the plaques and actually making it into an interpretive center more and an educational one and such that would really enhance the historic value of the site. So people could understand all the things, that history lesson that you just did, which is so wonderful. People don't read those reports, obviously. What they do is they go to a site and they want to see that.
Mm-hmm.
We have brochures. We started the docent program that hopefully you guys have benefited this summer. And that's my other question is, having started that program and looking for volunteers to do that all summer, do people have any thoughts about it? Did that work out well? Was that a nuisance having it open sometimes? And the schedule that we had for it, which was once a month on Sundays and Thursday nights, or I'd like some feedback on that one. Since, just so you know, for those who don't know me, I actually head up the Historic Preservation Commission. I started the docent program, and I do a lot of events to make history come alive to people and people be more appreciative of history of the city. So I'm always looking for different ways to do that. So any input and feedback you can give me would be very helpful.
So if you could connect with Brandon, we have about 15 minutes left. So I did, in talking about the plaques and telling the story of the site, we did internally, the team was talking about, there is this fine line that we want to get to between not putting too much visual clutter there, because I think we all like that it's a passive and naturalistic park, but also being able to tell the very different things that have happened to and at this place. And one of the things that we thought about was maybe the wall could be used to tell that story. What's the reaction? I see some thumbs up, but I mean in a very kind of tasteful.
Right.
So that's something I think we can explore.
There are a couple of plaques there now, and they get a great deal of attention, actually. I have to say, a lot of people go up and get enjoyment out of reading those plaques and reading about that time period.
The misspelling that I hear about all the time.
True. But
Because they read it, that's the good side.
I think those things are great, really.
Yes.
They provide a little bit of history, and it's part of the entertainment of the park, really. Just has to be done in a nice way.
Yes.
Can I take advantage actually of other landscapers being here? Because one thing we've talked about before is the wall. For those of you who don't know, we can't change that wall. It's part of the historic fabric now. It's hard to believe, but it's been there more than 50 years, and I've argued unpersuasively to the state we have to keep it. So knowing that, how do we disguise it? How do we enhance it and such? So I'm curious, the thought has been about having vines up there, which somebody already said tonight, which is great. Is that something that we can do, or is that, I've also been told, is not good for the wall, that it affects the integrity of the material, just like on brick and things like that, and therefore it's not something that you would advise. Is that how you're feeling?
So that's something that we're going to explore.
Okay. So. And then the second thing related to that is painting the wall is another idea. If you can actually put vines on there, what if we painted vines on there? Is that something that people have strong feelings?
I don't know. We're going to think very creatively on all of those things. So we have time for one more comment, and then I have to do a little bit of housekeeping. Oh.
So the comment I was going to make is in terms of adding historical detail without a lot of clutter, and I mentioned this at the walkthrough too, is at Habitat in Belmont, they have different places where there are numbers and you can call a phone number and then you can listen to an audio tour about a particular place, and I think that that's a really effective way of giving people more information without having a lot of clutter. So if that's something that could fit in, I think that that's a really fun sort of treasure hunt kind of thing to do.
That is something that we have talked about. It's a little tough because, the QR codes are very popular for a while and then nobody uses them. So I think we may need to look at a strategy that tries to get to people on many different levels. And with that, are there any
Can I just
other?
make one more thing
Yes.
that I wanted to add was on the in terms of different plantings, I would really love to see any kind of edibles going into the park. I think it would be really neat to have people be able to access those when they're in the park. Blueberry bushes or raspberry bushes, I think would be really neat.
There is one aspect of the park that we didn't mention is the music, and that's one of my favorite part is there is a lot of music going on, especially I forgot the name that you use for that dangerous place.
The middle layer of the cake?
It looks like, not the shed, around
the cake, the middle layer of the cake.
Yeah, the middle part, yeah. Sometimes it is a place for rehearsal, and it looks like a stage, and the acoustic is really good. And I want to preserve that because I think a lot of people use it in the summer to play music, and it's a nice part. Yeah.
So that's one of the spontaneous things that you only know when you're there all the time. So thank you for letting us know about that. Yes. Yes, the weddings we know about.
So is the water fountain, is that something that people really care about?
Which water fountain is that? You mean the water, the drinking fountain? The drinking fountain, yeah.
It
Most,
doesn't work a lot of the time, but is that something that's important to people to bring back so that it does work? And
Maybe add a couple, at least one other.
so a little bit more of house cleaning in the sense that, you know, we started off the meeting telling you all the places where we're communicating with you. So there is a mailing list here. I think many of you probably got on the email list. If you don't have email, I will put your address or your phone number. I will make sure to do that. I'm a little bit disheartened by the not so many people here. So if you guys have any ideas of how to get people to the next meeting, we're absolutely open. We have put it out everywhere that we know, but obviously let people get the word out. We really do appreciate that help. I want to thank again Alderman McWaters, who's really championed this project and really brought it to this place where we're getting ready to get a design, getting the funding in place. His advocacy has been really valuable to us, so thank you to you. And then the other point I want to bring up is that we do have some friends groups that we've started with different parks. So we should keep that conversation going. Friends groups tend to take on a lot of different forms depending on who's in it, who's involved, how much work they want to do or don't do. So, you know, at the end of this process, we will certainly want to get that friends group started. It's not necessarily a city thing, but we like to encourage that because we do think that landscape stewardship is very important. And then if we can just go back one slide, I want to go through the timeline again, just so we are understanding what we're trying to mark, what we're trying to hit. So this month in November, we should find out from the state if we have gotten the park grant, PARC, and that is some state funding that actually funds much of our parks work. And then in December, I will be writing an application to the CPA. The Community Preservation Act has funded the design of this project, so it's actually very important. And there will be a public component to that, a public meeting where people can go and speak about the different projects that are being proposed. So we will be going to them for money for CPA. Yes? No. If we don't get the park grant, then we have to kind of think about what other funding sources and how it's going to work. But we have gotten most of the park grants we have applied for, and I'm pretty optimistic that we will be getting it. I took the park grant lady up to the top and kind of was like, isn't this the best thing ever? And she was duly impressed. So I'm optimistic that that will happen. There's a certain amount of money, and then there's a city match, and that will be coming from CPA funds. So that in December, I will be writing the application for that.
Can you share what the amount of money that is?
No, because I don't know yet. So when I know it, we will be putting out the application, and I think they sit online and you can see them.
There's a standard maximum, as folks may know, which is $400,000 of state money. That requires like a 35 or 40% local match. So
yes.
Often that ends up being about $200,000 or $250,000 of local money. So that's kind of a standard part of our financing potpourri for a lot of parks, whether the largest or the smallest.
But the CPA amount that I'll be asking for, I don't know yet. So in terms of the design team, where we are now is that we would like to come back to you in December, because what I was getting at is that if we get the park grant, we need to start constructing in June. And yes, it's summer and it is the time when people most love the park, but it's also the time when we have to construct because winter doesn't work. So we would start on June 1st and go through that construction season and hopefully be done in the spring of 2019. Ideally, we'd like to be done in the fall of 2018, but it really is going to depend on how much work needs to get done. So it will be an inconvenience. The park will be shut down for some time, but there isn't any other way to renovate it. So we ask for your patience on that. It means then that we have to get a set of construction documents out to bid in February. So we need to kind of have the public process that we need to have, get the construction documents done, and then put that out to bid as soon as we can. So the next step in this is that we take back your thoughts. And again, in some ways, this project is a little different than others because we don't have a clean slate. There are strict historic parameters, and we know we're not changing it drastically. But we come back to you in December with conceptual and some of the ideas that we've started to flesh out. And then we would like to do a third meeting, or however many more are necessary, but that we come to you when we get a final consensus on it. What's really helpful in that process is if you can get as many people to come to the meetings as possible. If they can't come to the meetings, we will be putting the slide presentation and the video of the meeting online. So please get people to listen to watch it and to understand what's happening. And then other things, again, the flyering and the hoping people don't rip down the things, or if you see those kind of things, any kind of stewardship that you can give is really helpful to us, because we do want as many people as possible at all these meetings, because inevitably people show up to the fourth meeting and say, I wanted a Ferris wheel, and we've already been through the reasons why that. Yes, so in this case, normally we do try to give a little bit more notice, but in this case, because of the time that the contract was signed and the time that we had, this is what we had. But again, I'm looking for early to mid December, and as soon as I have a date, I will send you out a save the date. You can forward my email to others, and they can sign on to get onto that MailChimp list. I know you have some community listservs, so please share them far and wide. And
I'd like to know how people at the next meeting, how people feel about irrigation. Like if you're planning on irrigating, I just would like.
So if we're going to have lawns, we have to have irrigation. They don't do well. The lawns are pretty water intensive and require irrigation, among other things, good soil conditions. So I think if we want to plan for a lawn that's not going to look like what it looks like now, there's a number of steps that we need to take, and one of them is an irrigation system. It can come from the rain, but if you look at the lawn now, when it's dry and we have periods of drought, then. So the irrigation systems are actually, they have moisture sensors on them, so when it rains, they're somewhat efficient in that way. Can we collect the rain to irrigate it? I'm going to say that it's unlikely in this particular project. There have been some projects where we have done that, but given the fact that we can't change the park in many ways, I think that's pretty unlikely for this one, and we can talk more about that.
Just in terms of people feeling like they're part of the process and feeling satisfied with the resolution, I really think that having more than one meeting between now and when the final plan is presented is really helpful. It gives people a little bit more opportunity to come along the way and to fine-tune what the community wants and what the design might allow. And especially since there's so many different partners in this project with historic preservation, I would just ask you to consider having at least one, if not two, additional meetings in the middle so that there can be more discussion of the
So I think there are
pieces.
2 meetings listed there. So this is the second meeting. We
Right.
propose a third and then a fourth meeting, and if we require more, then we're open to that. We will also have to go before the Historic Preservation Commission, and I will send you out a letter and put it on, or send you on the email list when I'm going before the Historic Preservation. That's also a public meeting that you can give feedback on, and there is a public meeting with the CPA. So that's 5 public meetings that we're planning for this. And then if there are other ones that we need to have, we will have them. But we need to also be mindful that if we want to try to get this target date for construction, we need to have those meetings before we finish the final set. You can't get into construction documents and then have public meetings.
But is the meeting number 4 where we would anticipate presentation of a final design?
If we're at that point, yes. If we needed additional meetings, then no.
Okay.
So the next one, we're going to come to you with some conceptual designs and some things that are more fleshed out. And then if we're saying go in that direction, we would continue. That phase is called design development. If you're saying, no, that's not anything, go in this direction, then there would be more design coming into it. So it's an iterative process. So next meeting, that's what we're proposing. We're going to present to you is the ideas that you've given us. We start to think about them. And then from there, we see, do we need more meetings? Are we ready to start developing a final landscape plan? And then once we have a final landscape plan, they're going to start producing those construction documents, and then we put them out to bid and get someone to build this.
And so, if I can also chime in to assure folks that, it's more important to do this stuff right than do it fast. We want to honor the local tax dollar. We want to take advantage of state grant dollars that are on the table. And we also know from your comments tonight and from many other folks that there are challenges that need to be addressed in the park. So obviously getting to a moment where we can get into construction bidding and construction start is attractive for a variety of reasons. However, if we're not ready for prime time, we haven't built enough consensus, we're not going to fall into the Lincoln Park conversation again. We're not going to spend 5 years saying, we're going to design X, Y, and Z, and then have folks say either I wasn't consulted properly or this is inconsistent with my vision. That doesn't do anybody any favors. It pits neighbor against neighbor. It's constituents against elected officials against staff, and frankly makes for a lot of frustration and missed opportunities. So we will use this as a deadline to try to give you the answers and the opportunities that you need. But if come January we're not where we need to be, again, it's more important to do it right than fast. So you do have our word that we're going to do our darndest to get everything where it needs to be, but that we'll also make sure that there's plenty of opportunities for kind of those feedback loops. And if we're not ready for it, we'll take that step back and wait and see.
But please help us get more people in the room because we want a more inclusive. Yes?
Given the communication channels or difficulties, I would like to suggest that there be some kind of a board or some kind of a weatherproof entity that's up there that you can post notices on, so that when you put a notice up, it doesn't blow away, the wind and all the other things. It's a challenge, just so you know, again, as a city official, I can tell you for the docent program, we put more flyers up there than I want to tell you, and I laminated them and everything else. They just don't stay over time, and yet it's very important for you and the neighborhood, as well as people that come throughout the city and throughout the region that come to that tower. It is getting so much publicity now and so much interest. It's wonderful. But on the other hand, we need to have a way to inform people about what's happening, what's coming up, as you said, in advance, so that people can actually participate in. So my suggestion is certainly to put it in the plan for what we go forward with, but if there's some way we can put some other kind of a temporary structure up there now, so when you post these notices, or I put things up about the flag raising event January 1st, for those that don't know it, I think everybody here probably does, that would be a place to post it that will have longevity to it. And that DPW can do that. It doesn't have to be a high-fangled thing.
The neighborhood list, everyone's on them. I haven't seen too much solicitation for feedback from that. I can imagine a great discussion happening on that and us being able to pass that on. So if you need one of us to post something soliciting feedback or announce
that's
something.
difficult with that is I think it's super helpful when people are watching the presentation and looking at the slides and then commenting. But without doing that, you often get a lot of stuff that is, so as much as you can encourage informed and productive criticism, absolutely, we would love your help in any way, or folks who don't speak English, or folks who don't have internet. These are all people that we really struggle to get a hold of, and as you saw, we have as many resources as we do, so we would love your help with that. If there are no other questions or comments, I'd like to thank you for being here today. I'd like to thank Kyle and Danielle for their great history lesson. I think they did a great job. And we are going to pick a date in December, and as soon as I know that, I will let you guys know. My email is on all of the emails that you get, so you can always call back. You can always email me directly, or you can call City Hall and just say my name. Oh, sorry. Oops. I cheated in 7th grade typing class, I have to admit to you. 725-6600. Extension, yes, thank you. 6600, it's the main city number. You could just say my name or ask for extension 2529. Thank you. Thanks.